we're going to go over how to flesh an otter soup to nuts. So this is one I just took off a board. It came out, I believe, pretty darn well. So we're going to talk about how to get an otter pelt from rough skin to this condition. So first I'm going to put this away from the heat. You want to keep your pelts nice and cool once they come off. Things we need, obviously an otter pelt. So this is one that was skinned the other day. This is about 2-3 days old. I like to freeze or at least cool down all of my pelts after I have skinned them. Start with a pair of gloves. And the reason I do that is I feel like it kind of sets up the fat and the flesh a little bit better. That's what happens when you buy cheap gloves. So an important thing to think about when you're freezing fur or when you're cooling off fur, and you can freeze fur for a good period of time depending on the species. Otter, beaver, they've got a thicker hide. They can last quite a while in the freezer. Always freeze it flesh to flesh. So you see I've got this thing rolled up. So I turn it out so that is, again, flesh to flesh. My little trick is I like to roll them when I'm, so now we're going the other way. If we were going to be putting this away to go in the freezer, tail up to the nose. And the reason is when you're trying to thaw these out and you take it out of the freezer and you're, oh geez, I want to do that tomorrow. Well, it's nice to have this part so that when you can hang it up for thawing and it'll thaw as it falls. So that's just something we do with our fur. So we got our otter pelt. I need to get my apron here as best I can. And we're going to be using a couple different knives today. So we'll use a double-handled necker knife. I like to have kind of a duller, so that I don't keep this blade sharp, but a dull kind of flat knife, and then a really sharp knife. And these are an otter that we caught in a beautiful pinch point here kind of close to our house. It's one that we've been trapping for several years now. And once you find those otter spots, they have a tendency to produce year after year. So we'll get loaded up here. So you got to have something to kind of lean into your beam with, because we're going to be right here, right? So again, when we're using a fleshing beam, there's multiple ways to flesh. We're using a beam. This one's a little bit wide. This is actually my beaver beam, but my otter and coyote beam that Riley's got her hand on there, we had set up for a friend who was learning how to flesh the other day, and I just haven't my first shed's a bit out of whack. So fleshing beam, fleshing knives are otter, and then a thing of water here. So this water we're going to use to keep our beam nice and wet. So the deal with otters, and it's the only species I know of that you have to do it, is that they have a tendency to singe. And what that means is that long, beautiful guard hair, just like if you were stripping a ribbon, if you were to pull on that, it kind of gets a little bit of a singe to the end of it. So that can happen. It happens naturally all winter while they're laying on the ice. An otter comes out, it's playing on the ice, and it lays down, and it sits there for a minute, and it freezes in just a little bit, and it stands up, and the ice, will strip that. But it can also happen from just being too hard on that guard hair on your beam. So I like to keep my beam pretty wet here. Now, Riley's going to help us get a nice close look at this. And again, you can see, right, that's as far as I can bring this down. I should have a thinner beam, but I can kind of make up for that. I'm only going to be working about this 6-inch section. Generally speaking, when you're fleshing fur, you don't want to get too far down here because you can see things start to wrinkle and you have a tendency to cut. So Riley's going to help us hone in on some of these more technical pieces of the otter. And then from there, we'll just set it up and I'll finish off the otter and kind of show you what it looks like. It'll probably take about a half hour to flesh. So there's a few major pieces on an otter. The first one that I find to be kind of difficult is right behind the ears and in this section here. And it's one of those things where there's not a lot going on. There's not a lot of flesh to take off. You got to get it off though. And so it can feel a little bit like you're getting too close. Then we'll talk about around the face and the eyes, and we'll move to the tail. So with otters, I like to keep a really, really sharp knife. So I'm going to start on this kind of meaty piece here on the otter. What I'm doing is I'm pinching that skin in between my belly and the fleshing beam, making sure this is nice and tight. I only want to be working on a tight surface. I'm going to start with starting to get lightly slice. And I hate using the slice word because it's a really quick way to cut pelts. But it's all about the pressure. I am not using a lot of pressure here. I mean, it's just about the pressure of the blade itself, of the knife itself. There's different parts of that otter where you're going to start using more pressure. But to start, it's really light in this area. And so what I'm doing is I'm moving that pelt because I always want to be working right here. And that's something when we're teaching people, we often see there's a tendency to kind of work down, 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 down. You want to always be working right here. And yeah, again, light pressure and that kind of slicing.
Do people need a double necker knife?
You don't need it. There's different ways. There's different knives to do this with. There's different ways to flesh, but this is the way we do it, I guess. So this again is kind of a part right between the two ears working back that can be tough, and I have a tendency to slide. It's a place that is rife for cutting, and now you don't really need to get too deep. You just need to get this stuff off. So sometimes in this specific spot, I'll take my sharp knife I have and I'll hold up the stuff I need to get off. And I'll kind of just go along with the board. Again, fleshing is all about angles and pressure. And so I'm not using a lot of pressure with this knife. And my angle is, 10, 15 degrees. It's not a lot. I'm going just about the same angle as the beam and just slicing this stuff off. So we'll work around the head. And again, you gotta have a scrap bucket. It just kind of comes with it, and it's our scrap bucket is pretty nasty at this point.
No,
so
this is rated PG-13.
Right. So I work around the top of the head first. Now I'm getting back kind of on the other side we were talking about. That's where that sharp knife comes in. And a little bit of tissue, like a little bit of this stuff, is okay to be left. That's not going to make or break anything, but this red stuff is what you really, you have to get the red off, and you have to get that deep fat off. And again, here, like I know that it's going to take me a while with my fleshing knife, and the probability of me cutting it is higher there, so I'm just kind of getting ahead with my sharp knife. So we're coming to the point about where that animal got caught in a body grip. And so this is somewhere you really want to be careful because that is a thinner spot. There was trauma at that location as far as, talking about the cells of the skin. And so I'm just really, again, sharp angle, sharp knife, low pressure. And these short kind of quick motions I personally have found to be pretty effective on otter. Now before we get into the main gravy, again I'm going to take my otter off and I'm going to wet my beam just to keep that, there's some bit of lubrication to your board. Right? Now I'm going to come right down the middle of the back. And so this is the part of the otter. It really kind of has the most stuff on it. But this is also, I'm coming right down the back. This is your money spot, so you want to be really, really careful not to nick it in here. Again, kind of short motions. And the shorter the motion you go, the less of the likelihood you have of making some big major tear. If you were to slice it just a little bit, something gets caught just a little bit, or you can feel it and you can stop.
Are you always keeping the same angle?
On an otter, I am mostly keeping the same angle. Sometimes on beavers, you'll come to the edge, you'll push, and I might do that a little bit really on the tips on the actual edges. But for the most part, we're keeping pretty similar angle. So see that right there? That's getting close to going through the skin. That, you know, that was we consider a close call. So you just want to be cautious of that, and when you see that, kind of reevaluate. Okay, what was I doing? Was I going a little too fast? Was I going a little too hard? Was my angle too severe? So now we're coming to the tail. And I like to come right down my back and then just get my tail out of the way. Admittedly, otter tails are the bane of my existence. I think they're the bane of many others' existences as well. They're tough, they're difficult. So I like to get kind of just started with my necker. And then I know guys that do this whole thing with their necker knife. And that's definitely a way to do it. Now, once you get right here, I don't know if you can see, the otter's tail kind of has a wave to it. And so if I were to continue on with this knife, you know, there's a pretty good chance I'm going to cut it. So essentially, once I start seeing that wave, I'm going to trim off the stuff that I've, you know, all this extra fat, and I'm going to start doing this by hand. Not the quickest way to do it by any means. Need a rag for wiping. But I think it produces, for me, you know, a pretty decent tail. And if I'm going to mess up on an otter, this is usually where it happens. So again, I'm using my sharp knife, and I'm just going to start kind of trimming. So I'm going to trim that right off. Come to this other side. Same thing, I'm just going to trim this little sliver right off. Now this is where I have a tendency to step away from my beam, and you know, their tails are so big and they carry so much fat. This is one of the places that an otter stores its fat for the winter.
So you literally meant step away from your beam.
I literally like I get my sportsman's pose on, and I just kind of pick away at this. Again, I know that there's people who've done a lot more otter than me who can do this a lot quicker, more efficiently, but
this is your sharp knife.
This is my sharp knife. I'm kind of going down that edge, being careful of scratching up my beam. So that's often I get the edges and I get the middles, because that otter has this natural, like I said, it's kind of got a wave to its tail, and what it is everybody else's tail that we're putting up is nice and round, whereas an otter's tail is kind of flat. So when you cut down the middle and you skin around, you've got these two balls of fat that you got to be careful of. So there's a ridge in the middle and these two divots here and here. You just got to work through them slowly. You know, try to keep the fat off your tail fur. So, well, I mean, you're going to get it on it, but just try to be careful about coming back and getting it. I start with my edges, and then I'll move to my middle. Just cutting those edges pretty well cleaned up. Now I'm coming back to my middle with that sharp knife. And I mean, my angle is not, I'm trying to move that sharp blade across the top of the beam. You know, I'm trying to keep it right in the same line with the beam. Once you start going like this, you have a tendency to cut down. I want my blade to skip across, exactly, just a little bit more of an angle than parallel. I want to skip across that beam, or across the skin. You know, the fat, the membrane between the fat and the skin is much is not as tough as skin. And so you're trying to slide that blade between those two things. Depending on how your beam is set up, mine, the nose always touches the ground. It just is what it is. Get a little bit of sawdust and stuff on that nose. Clean this up before I go to the tip. Again, remember to always keep your beam as clean as possible. And when we're doing otters, we got to worry about keeping our floor clean, because Joey, who's our go-to beaver cleanup guy, has no interest in otters. He's got no interest in otter fat, no interest in the smell. That's where you really start to get down to the tip. It just works slow. I like to work right on the horn of my beam for this part. And this tail, I did not cut all the way to the end, so I'm going to stick my knife blade in there. Open that up. You can see that kind of ridge of fat. We're almost done. This is my least favorite part of the otter. And you want to get this pretty clean, but a little bit of fat left over is not the end of the world. It'll dry. So that's kind of, and you can see there's still a little bit there, and I could go and I could pick and pick and pick. But for the most part, that is pretty darn good. Now, one thing you can do, just to try and really make sure that your tail dries as best it can. Again, make sure you put that water down so you don't singe it, but using the dull side of your knife at a 90-degree angle. And you go slow, because this is an easy way you'll catch something, all that hard, beautiful work that you've done, you'll rip your tail off. So just go nice. I'm putting some pressure down, but going easy to make sure nothing catches. And this is called milking. I'm just working some of that fat residue out. So, tail's done. So next we're going to go to the face to show you what I do there. And now, this is the deal with the face, is that if you're selling into the market, face doesn't matter a ton as far as the value of your pelt. If an eye's a little big or whiskers a little this or that, we put up our fur to use, for products. So the face isn't really the end of the world if something gets messed up, but I just like to take pride in what we're doing. So you've got whiskers here between the eye and the nose. You've got a couple other little sets of whiskers. So again, I'm using a sharp knife, and I'm going to go over the top of those, and I'm pressing down. I'm doing this motion. I'm doing like a C motion. Pressing down to cut in, and I'm coming up. And what it is, you want to get this chunk of meat and fat off, because you need to get that off for it to dry appropriately. But if you cut too deeply, you'll get to the whisker follicles, which we'll show you in just a second, because I'm sure we'll get close. And if you cut the end of the whisker, that right there is a whisker follicle. And if you get too close, you cut the bottom of that follicle, and the hair that whisker will fall out. Again, if you're selling right into the open market, they're going to be used as garments, not the end of the world. But if you want to have a wall hanger, or if you're going to be selling pelts as educational pieces, which we sometimes do, you want to make sure all these whiskers are as good as possible. So now between that bottom lip and the nose, there's another set of whiskers that I'm not going to spend a ton of time on, because I know I'll cut them if I try to really clean them up too much. So I'm going to leave that. See those follicles there? I'm going to come down to the lip. So this is the inside of the lip, and I'm going to cut that right off, clean with the fur. A little bit of the bottom lip came off. That's okay. That's going to come off later anyway. So then I come back to my eye, around the eye. Again, I'm using that C motion. I'm going to cut this a little bit off. There's some whisker follicles, some hair follicles right there. So again, just being careful. Behind the eye. You know, otters do a lot of hunting underneath the water in dark, murky environments. So they've got all these whiskers on their face. They're really, really cool animals. So if you want those whiskers to stay on, you just got to make sure that you don't cut the bottom of that follicle. So I'm coming up to my ear. Again, C motions, I'm kind of coming into my ear. I'm not cutting through it. I'm trying to feel it and come up along it. And then I just work around it. So, okay, start at the ear. Again, C motion to get started. And I'm using that sharp knife to slice, slice, slice. I'll come to...
For this part, are you always holding the pellet with this hand, or is that because I'm in your way?
No, I always hold it with this hand because I'm keeping it tight. I want this to be as tight as possible. Although I usually do stand where Riley's standing. So you get the point of view. Look here. So that was one side. So that's kind of, you know, that's decent enough. Might trim up my lip a little bit more. And I'll be honest, I am spending too much time on my faces. And you'll hear, I'm sure people will say that. Way too much time on the faces, too much effort. It's true, but I've always had something about producing a good face. Just, I don't know if it's a respect for the animal. I mean, when we make fur products, we cut the faces right off. Like, we don't even use it, but there's something about honing the art and just producing a quality product that the face has always kind of been that next level thing for me. Personally. So again, you could probably spend about half this time, but you know, my recommendation, the way we do it, you know, just kind of our how-to per se, and ours definitely isn't perfect. It's not necessarily the right one, but we spend a lot of time on our faces to make sure they look nice and pretty, as much for us as for anybody else. Coming around that ear. Keeping the pelt nice and tight. That's usually I'm using my belly to pin it. When I'm working like this with one hand, I use my other hand. So I'm coming down around the bottom of the face, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that bottom lip, and I'm going to kind of I'm going to get started here, because I'm going to cut that bottom lip off. We don't need that. So once I'm here and I know I'm going to have something for my belly to rest on, kind of give myself space, I take my knife, come around on that bottom lip. I'm just going to even that off. Some guys do that once it's on the beam. Once it's on the board, when we're boarding it, that's just fine too. So now the next thing is just going to be working around this whole animal and working down through. So now everything else I have to do is just with the fleshing knife. So what you'll start to figure out on otters, on any animal, is like there's parts that you can really there's thin parts and there's thick parts. And so, right now I'm on the throat of the otter, so it's real thin. So again, slicing motions, short little motions, and I'm not putting a ton of pressure down. And I kind of like to work down these, well, it kind of changes, but I like to try to get to the arms, and then I'll make a path, and then I'll kind of take the edges. So we'll we'll just kind of work through this, and I'll talk about the different thicknesses as we go. But the belly and the throat, real thin. And again, this is the mark where we caught it in the body grip. And so you just want to be careful through there.
Does the trauma make the skin thinner?
Yeah, it's just, it's a bruise. It's just essentially a bruise. And so you just want to it's a little bit weaker when you're working on it. So another tip is, don't ever put that bruise right on the horn of your beam and push on it. You always want to be working around it. So I'm working here, and then I'm going to jump past it and work here. Now we're going to get down to our arms. See, I'm always moving my pelt to keep working right in that kind of sweet zone. And now what I'm doing here is I'm working up to and then around my arm. So I'm going to get all this stuff out of the way. I'm going to put my arm right over the horn of that. And I'm going to cut a little bit of this off so I don't worry about getting right to the edge. I start 1/2 inch down. I'm right in the armpit. So I really got to go nice and easy. Again, I'm using about the pressure of the weight of the blade. And now this is a female, so we know that coming up we're going to have nipples on this belly that we want to be careful for, because if you're just cruising through, you can catch a nipple and open it up. I'm not saying I won't do that. I have a tendency to catch those moving too fast. Now you see how that skin's starting to buckle, right? I'm doing this and the skin's starting to buckle. It means it's not tight enough. And bring it back here, make it get nice and tight. Because I want to slide over the top of the skin. So we're just removing the fat. Come around the rest of my arm. Get that nice and cleaned up. Again, coming back into that armpit region, so I'm just going real nice and careful. All right, so I got one arm. I'm going to get the other arm. And then we'll move down from there. I love trapping otters. Otters get quite the rap, especially social media, all these things these days, as being these really cute, critters that there's this misunderstanding that they're, illegal to harvest, because people are confusing them with sea otters. This is a North American river otter. River otters are highly abundant, and I tell people this whenever I get the opportunity. They're highly abundant. They are highly regulated. The seasons are highly regulated by state officials who have done all the research to make sure that there's enough of these individuals on the landscape for us to pursue. Season limits, season dates are set in place, and then regulated by conservation officers to make sure that all these things are happening correctly. And so this is the definition of a renewable resource. Otters in particular have the highest hair follicle per square inch of any other fur bears. That means the number of actual hairs that they have on every square inch exceeds every other fur bear, and that gives them an unbelievable R value, or an insulating value. So from an insulating perspective, fur utilization, they're a really, really special animal. Are they cool? Absolutely. They're one of the coolest animals that I've ever seen. And I doubt there's many people out there that love an otter as much as I do. But the most intimate relationship that I have with an otter is pursuing them in this way. You get to learn their habitats, you get to learn what they're doing, when they're doing it, why they're doing it. So I just, I'd urge you, if you're going to otter trap and you're going to start putting up otter fur, I'd urge you to kind of get some of those key messages down so that you're ready to talk to people and they say, geez, why are you trapping otters? Aren't those protected? I haven't done in a while. So now all we have left is the two sides and the belly. We'll just work. Now we're just working down through. But remember, there's going to be some nipples in here that we want to be careful of. Short little motions. Again, kind of a slicing, but I use that word in hesitation because slicing can really lead us to some bad habits. Now look at this, we had a wound. I had a wound on this otter. And because I was doing a slicing motion, I didn't open it up. But this otter, it's right off the side of its back. And I don't know if it's from another otter or what it's from, but I'm going to work really careful around the edge of that. You can see it wants to open up. I mean, it is ready. And when we dry it, it might a little bit. It's okay on a wound like that. It's okay to leave a little bit of fat. You're better off to leave a little fat than to go trying to dig it all up and busting this right open. The other thing I'm going to do now is avoid putting that anywhere near my horn for the rest of this otter. So see, I'm going to come at an angle here to get this stuff down below it. And I also, now I've got it in my head, okay, this otter got into something. That's a pretty clean slice. You can see it wants to open up so bad. It's fairly recent. So I'm just going to be on the lookout for other wounds. Again, so that's a nipple right there. I want to be careful about. So sometimes when I come into sensitive areas, whether it's a wound or nipple, I'm going to come back to my sharp knife where I can just make nice little cuts. Find that nipple, come over the top, start right on the other side. Same thing with nipples. It's okay to leave just a little bit of fat there rather than go messing around trying to get everything and busting a big hole open. So I'm going to do a lot of this area right around the edge last because it's the messiest part. It's going to get my beam the messiest. So I'm going to come back up, start where I left off. This is the time period where you really want to make sure you're working in that kind of 6-inch range from the horn of your beam, because you start getting down here, it's tempting. You're making a big long swath, things are going good, and like right here's a perfect example, boom. You start to get a little bit of your hide kind of getting bunched up, and you can cut it really easily. Okay, so now we're getting pretty close to the end of our otter. I'm going to clean this up. You're going to have to run some of your fleshing out onto the beam, so you just want to make sure you have a rag handy to keep your beam as close as possible. Okay, nose and nipple there. There's going to be another one. I believe otters have, they have 4 nipples. I forget if they might have 6. So we know it's coming up. Just want to be mindful of it. Oh, there it is. Again, I like to switch kind of a sharper knife. Using that kind of C shape around it. Got around those. Now I might as well just kind of use this knife. And I think the key to not cutting open nipples and all that stuff, just go slow. Gonna be another one right about. Feel it out. Okay, it's gonna be right there. So there they are. So I'm gonna cut this stuff off. Switch my knives again. I'm going to come right down to the edge. And this is where you be careful about a couple things. One, you be careful at your beam. Super easy to come off the edge of this and kind of come over the hump and boom. I mean, you can see I got tons of scars from that on my beam. So it happens, but I try to avoid it. So I get it right up to the edge as close as I kind of can. And then you do 2 things. You can either really work the edges off the knife, or what I do is I try to get between the skin and the fat, and you can cut off just the tiniest little bit of fur with it. And, you're not going to hurt anything. You don't want to be taking big, huge chunks out here, but just a tiny little bit, that's okay. See this right here, this little pinch, got to get that off. Again, I want to keep this beam nice and clean. At this point, I'm just working on the edges. I'm done with my water. And move that because I know that's a disaster waiting to happen. And right underneath those nipples where the vulva was, you can, actually I don't know if that's the right word. This is where the anus and the vagina were. You can cut some of that off too in what would be a window. When I first started fleshing, I did a lot with just a single knife, and so I became pretty comfortable with using a blade to flesh, and now I have a tendency in tricky spots to kind of get back to that. All right, so that is now finished. I'll wipe my beam off one last time. So that's finished. You can see it's pretty well free of fat. There's a little bit here and there, but that'll dry. and we'll do a video on how to properly board and dry an otter. But this is kind of the finished product that you're going for. Again, I know we already looked at it, but so this will look like that. And you can see where, like up here between the, around the eyes, a little bit of that red stuff. It's okay, it'll dry. You just want to make sure you dry it adequately. And we're going to cut those arms off. That's why we didn't spend a lot of time there. This is obviously a male. So hope that helps. Thanks for following along.